Forget the postcard version of the Middle Ages, the fluttering banners, the gleaming plate, the knight who bows, quips and wins by honor. Real battlefields didn't reward poetry. They rewarded physics. Victories came from blackened forges and the grim imagination of weaponsmiths who studied armor the way locksmiths study locks. Only these keys opened people. Behind every charge and banner line were artisans who turned fear into hardware and hardware into outcomes. Start with the weapon that punctured the knightly illusion more brutally than any satire, the warhammer. For a generation or two, plate armor looked like the medieval cheat code. If you were rich enough, you could wear an engineered miracle curved steel that sloughed off sword cuts, shrugged at arrows, and made you feel like a walking fortress. Knights poured fortunes into Milanese and Gothic suits, betting that money could buy them extra lives. Then somebody swung a hammer, not a carpenter's mallet, not a blacksmith's ball peen, the battlefield warhammer. Compact head, dense mass, and a face meant to focus force into a small, merciless footprint. A sword spreads impact across an edge. A hammer concentrates it. You don't need to slice the metal. You just drive energy through it. Helmets dimpled, bones bowed, brains rattled. The steel did its job, stayed intact, and the person inside paid the price anyway. It's the cruel trick of momentum. If it can't go through, it goes in. Plate armor didn't always fail by breaking. It worked and still lost. Many warhammers doubled down with a spike on the back, one tool, two personalities. Flat face for crushing, spike for puncturing. If your opponent looked like a can, you had both the tenderizer and the opener. Against padded gambesons and mail, the hammer face turned muscle and cartilage into jelly. Against rigid plate, the beak hunted seams, visors, and joints. In the chaos of close quarters, that versatility wasn't theory, it was survival. And yes, it democratized killing. Swords demanded years of practice guards, binds, timing. A hammer asked for stamina, courage, and a target. That's part of why common soldiers loved it. Simple to learn, terrifyingly direct. Miss with a blade and it slides off. Miss with a hammer and you might still collapse a forearm. Swinging steel on a stick was, in a way, the first user-friendly interface of late medieval melee. Picture the soundscape for a second. Narratives talk about the clash of arms, but veterans remembered the thud's hammer on helmet, helmet on skull, skull on earth. At muddy fields like Agincourt, where cavalry bogged down and the richest men in Christendom found themselves thigh-deep and off-balance, the warhammer was a verdict. The armor that was supposed to save you became a trap you couldn't climb out of fast enough. Men-at-arms short-stepped in, shoulders braced, and drove blows down like they were putting in fence posts. Weapons evolve when defenses do. Early hammers were basically repurposed tools. Later they turned into specialists. Faces got ridges to bite into steel. Beaks sharpened, shafts reinforced. The better the armor, the nastier the head geometry. Mini-arms race, meet macro consequences. Knights trained in the chivalric arts discovered a brutal footnote. Status doesn't matter when inertia meets leverage. If you're visualizing a giant sledge, scale it back. Most battlefield hammers weren't cartoonishly heavy. That's how you actually fight with them. A compact head sometimes only a few inches across on a haft, long enough for reach and torque. Enough mass to matter, enough control to place shots. The goal wasn't to wind up like a catapult, it was to hit where the helmet is weakest, to drive into the hinge, the brow ridge, the temple, the collar. Precision violence. And yet, for all its practicality, the warhammer carried a psychological payload. It looked like a working tool. No romance, no courtly curves, just the promise of blunt ending. In a world that worshipped the sword as a symbol, the hammer read like a confession. This isn't ceremony, it's problem-solving. Even today, our imagination casts swords as heroic and hammers as grimy, and that's exactly why soldiers trusted them. Let's talk mechanics in plain language. When you swing, you're trading time for speed, longer arc, higher velocity. Put a dense head at the end of that path and you've got momentum. Affect it with a small contact area and you push pressure beyond what steel and skull are happy to absorb. Plate spreads cuts. It does a poor job spreading sudden, high-pressure spikes. That's why a blow can crumple the metal into the wearer, and even a non-penetrating hit can concuss, dislocate or break. The armor stops the edge. It can't stop the shock. And because hammers were honest about what they did, they were honest about who could use them. You didn't need a noble birth. You didn't even need a dueling pedigree. Farmers with good shoulders, smiths with forearms built by bellows, give them a week of drills on range, angle, and targeting, and they could alter the course of a melee. That's not to say skill didn't matter. Placing shots, recovering guard, keeping your feet in a scrum all demanded practice, but the entry ramp was lower. That changed who felt dangerous. Sometimes we romanticize the duel, the perfect parry, the riposte in a glitter of sparks. Warhammers weren't interested in that choreography. They were the punctuation mark at the end of somebody else's sentence. Get inside a long sword's ideal distance, jam the line, and throw short, savage shots that don't care about elegant lines. You can almost hear the training cues. Elbow in, hips through, head hidden, hit where the metal curves. Could a knight counter a hammer? Absolutely. Footwork, shields, polearms, team tactics. None of this happened in a vacuum. But the hammer forced choices. Put your guard high to shield the visor, and you expose the collarbone. Present the shield, and the beak fishes around it. Backpedal in mud, and you eat the ground. There's a reason manuals gradually diversify away from pure swordplay in the late period. The field was getting crowded with tools built to punish plate. And on the subject of punishment, the spike on the reverse deserves its own moment. It wasn't just for show. Joints are the chinks in any armor system: armpit, elbow, inside of the knee, groin, the seams around the visor. A quick half turn of the wrist presented the beak, and a lunge or short swing could thread those gaps. The hammer side breaks posture. The spike side ends possibilities. That two-tempo rhythm break, finish suited real fighting far more than the sculpted dueling forms we often picture. Archaeology quietly backs up the reputation. Surviving heads with faces worn smooth, haft sockets scarred by impact, dent patterns on helmets that match concentrated strikes, skeletal remains with localized fractures beneath areas that show no cutting trauma. Weapons leave signatures, the hammer signed in pressure and collapse. And if you want one last reason soldiers trusted it, consider maintenance. Swords bend, edges chip, tips snap. A hammer? Oil the head, check the pins, keep the haft from splitting, and it's ready to go again. In campaigns where weather and grime chew through equipment, boring reliability is a superpower. A weapon that still works on day 30 is better than a glamorous one that fails on day 3. So no, medieval battlefields weren't won by chivalric poetry. They were decided by men who understood mass, leverage, and human anatomy better than the songs admit. The warhammer is Exhibit A, a simple idea executed with ruthless clarity. Armor promised immortality. The hammer reminded everyone that physics never signed that contract. And as soon as defenders adapted to hammers, other minds in other forges asked a new question. What if you don't fight the shield? What if you cheat around it? What if your weapon refuses to travel in straight lines? That's where we're headed next. Into the unruly, chain-whipping, timing, breaking cousin that turned blocking into guesswork and nerves into jelly. If the warhammer was the straight-A student of armor problems, reliable, focused, always turning homework in early, the flail was the unruly genius who refused to show their work and still aced the exam. On paper, it's childishly simple. A wooden haft, a short chain, a spiked metal head. In practice, it's a physics midterm that never ends. The chain introduces slack, delay, and a wicked habit of ignoring the path you thought you were drawing through the air. Every swing becomes a conversation with momentum, and momentum lies. Here's why defenders hated flails, shields like rules. Rigid weapons, swords, axes, maces obey those rules. You raise a board, you catch a blow, and you deflect it along predictable angles. A flail refuses the contract. The chain lets the head wrap around edges, slip past guard lines, and arrive in places your arm didn't strictly point toward. You can block the stick and still get kissed by the business end. Imagine stepping perfectly into a parry, and then whip the spiked head comes prowling around the far side like it took a detour through bad intentions. The knight hears the rattle, sees the haft stop, and then feels the conclusion anyway. That unpredictability came at a cost, and the bill was due in training bruises. Plenty of medieval weapons demand respect, but flails punish the inattentive instantly. Manuals, where they discuss them at all, stress timing drills. Start slow. Learn the lag between haft motion and head response. Learn how to park the head with a turn of the wrist and a soft catch. Then launch it again without tangling your own limbs. First-time students discover a hard truth. Your offhand must steer the invisible. You're managing orbit, not just swing. Early sessions aren't about hitting targets, they're about not becoming one. And yes, self-injury was a running joke that wasn't always funny. A flail rewards smooth arcs and punishes choppy corrections. Overpull the chain and the head rebounds. Undercommit the swing and the head droops, then slams your knee when you step. Try to stop it dead, and it scythes past the half to clip your knuckles. Soldiers tell on themselves in the marginalia. Notes about wearing thicker gloves, binding wrists, soaking straps so they shrink tight. If the hammer is a handshake with kinetic energy, the flail is a custody battle. So why risk it? Because once you do tame the rhythm, a flail becomes a nightmare for shield-reliant fighters and anyone hiding behind tidy geometry. That loose head can attack from offset angles, dragging defenders into overreactions. Feint high the head snakes over the rim snap low, and it whips under to shin or knee. Feint outside shield bites roll your wrist, and the chain carries the head inside the guard, like a burglar sliding through a half-latched window. Against plate, spikes don't need to carve deep to matter. Even small punctures ruin joints, wreck visors, and invite infection. Against mail or padded coats, a flail combines stab and smash into one unhappy package. There's also the physics party trick. The chain amplifies tip speed. Think of it like a hinge. Your hands move a foot, the head can travel several and faster. With good timing, that whip effect concentrates more energy on impact than a rigid head of similar weight. Rigid weapons excel at line of force transfer hammer drives shock straight in. The flail excels at snap, turning a controlled circle into a sudden, nasty line. You feel it in the haft, through a dull tock, less jarring than a hard block, more vicious at the far end. Flails weren't a single blueprint. The classic single-chain, single-head version is only one branch. There are multi-headed variants that multiply chaos. Longer chain cavalry versions optimized for strikes from the saddle, and regional curiosities like hollow cord heads that whistle when accelerated psychological warfare layered on top of mechanical threat. That whistle matters. Pre-contact seconds are an emotional battlefield. A strange rising whee and a spiked globe arcing at your face encourage choices that aren't tactically sound, like flinching or blinking instead of stepping and covering. But let's stay honest. Flails were never as common on the battlefield as swords, spears, or even hammers. They're high maintenance. They need space to work. They require a handler who knows when not to swing. In tight infantry knots, an undisciplined flail user is a friendly fire incident with a leather strap. Their best life is in mixed lines, thick shields to pin the enemy, polearms to set range, and one or two flails prowling the margins, punishing overcommitments and reaching around defenses to make good armor feel insecure. The mental tax they levy is real. A veteran longsword fighter reads angles the way chess players read boards. Bind, feel pressure, decide. A flail distorts those reads, and a distorted read is half a second lost. That half second is where injuries live. Commanders understood this. Some placed flail specialists where enemy knights were likely to charge, not to stop the charge outright, but to scramble timing and posture so the second rank could finish the job. Think of them as timing saboteurs. Peasants and militias added another chapter. The military flail grew from farm tools used to thresh grain. In crises and uprisings, that familiarity became an asset. Take the barn implement you've already swung 1,000 times, reinforce the connection, add iron to the striking end, and you have something that behaves like a weapon you already understand. The Hussites of Bohemia made an art of this wagon. Forts anchoring lines, gunpowder in the mix, and flail teams darting out to punish armored elites who wandered too close. Nothing deflates a cavalry myth quite like getting your helmet rung by yesterday's threshing gear. All of this comes with a simple caveat. Skill separates spectacle from success. A flail can be cinematic in clumsy hands, chains whirling, dust spraying, lots of noise, and still do nothing except make a mess. In practiced hands, it's minimal. One or two tight circles to build speed, a short release, and the head appears in exactly the wrong place for the defender. Then the wielder doesn't chase the bounce. They catch it, releash the head with a small turn, and either reset or flow into the next angle. Smooth, quiet, controlled. That's the difference between being scary and being effective. What about counters? They exist. Shields come forward instead of staying flat, smothering the chain close to the boss. Polearms intercept the chain itself, killing the head's travel. Footwork denies the flail its favored arcs by stepping to the inside line. But counters rely on recognition, and recognition relies on calm. The flail's great gift is stealing calm. The rattle, the whistle, the not quite straight path, it all conspires to make trained people do untrained things. If you're wondering about the self-own problem in real fights, yes, it's real. People did hit themselves. That's why flail drill includes safety beats: pacing, spacing, and parking. You learn safe orbits that never cross your legs or your ally's head. You learn to aim with hips, not just arms. You learn that ending a swing well is as important as starting one well. Done right, a flail feels less like flinging violence and more like piloting it. A final note on story versus reality. Pop culture loves a morning star on a chain as the default flail. In period, you also see short, rigid-halved Morgensterns. We'll meet their spiky cousin later. And plenty of regional blending hybrids that aren't tidy enough for neat categories. The battlefield didn't care about tidy. It cared about what worked against men in iron. Which brings us to the next pivot in this arms race. Not finesse over shields, not leveraged chain tricks, but a brutally straightforward answer to armoured cavalry itself. A weapon so simple a village could outfit hundreds. So effective, it humbled Europe's finest horsemen. And so emblematic, it renamed an entire battle by its aftermath. No chain, no artfulness, just a stout shaft, a cruel spike, and the kind of tactic that turns momentum into a liability. In other words, when the rich ride at you like thunder, meet them with a good day. If flails messed with a knight's timing, the Flemish answer to armoured cavalry messed with a knight's confidence. Meet the weapon with the cheeriest name and the grimmest intentions. The Godendag, literally good day in Flemish. It's the kind of name that sounds like a handshake and functions like a death warrant. Picture a stout wooden shaft, thick as a forearm, capped with an iron spike. No frills, no moving parts, no mystery. Point the sharp end at the most expensive thing on the battlefield, and let momentum do the rest. To understand why the Godendag mattered, imagine Europe at the turn of the 14th century. Heavy cavalry is the gold standard. A mailed and plated knight on a trained warhorse is kinetic wealth status, muscle, and shock power all rolled into one. Infantry exists, yes, but mostly as the supporting cast. And then, on the 11th of July 1302, near Kortrijk in Flanders, townsmen and guild militias set the table for a very rude awakening at the Battle of the Golden Spurs. The French arrived with the best cavalry in Europe, and enough swagger to bring extra rope for tying prisoners. The Flemings arrived with pikes, Godendags, good terrain sense, and the calm that comes from knowing you can't outrun a charge anyway, so you might as well meet it with math. They dug ditches, picked muddy ground, and stacked their ranks tight. When the French advanced, horses bogged, intervals collapsed, and the charge lost its surgical point. That's when the geometry favoured the people on foot. Here's the simple, brutal tactic behind the Godendag. Front rank braces the butt of the shaft in the earth. Angle the spike toward the oncoming mass, knees bent, shoulders set. Back ranks press forward human sandbags to keep the line from buckling. A charging knight commits to speed. Speed commits him to inability to turn. In clean conditions, cavalry skims past or punches through. In churned-up ground, they arrive exactly where the infantry wanted them. Funneled, slowed, and predictable. And predictable is where spikes thrive. There's an almost physical comedy to the moment if you take the armour romance out of it. A trained destrier, magnificent animal lunges through muck. A knight lowers his lance. He's already decided his line 3 seconds ago because physics forced him to. Then he meets a forest of waist-high iron teeth, braced by people who do not intend to move. Best case, his horse shies, and the formation piles up. Likely case, the animal or the rider takes the spike. Worst case, they both do, and momentum turns nobility into a lever for its own unseating. The chevalier tumbles, hits the soup of earth and bodies, and suddenly his greatest asset, hundreds of metal pieces engineered to fit him perfectly, becomes a drowning weight. This is where the second personality of the Godendag shows up. It isn't just a stopper, it's a finisher. Once a knight is down, The same weapon that just served as an anti-tank pike becomes a club. The shaft is thick for a reason. You can drive the spike again, or you can bring the wood down like a mallet on the helmet, the collar, the elbow joint. It's piercing and crushing in a single tool, and it takes minutes to teach the basics. Brace, aim, push, then step, strike, clear. If Warhammer's democratized force by lowering the skill floor, the Godendag democratized tactics. A guild could outfit a couple hundred men quickly. Blacksmiths forge spikes, carpenters shape shafts, captains teach formation drills instead of sword choreography. You don't need a dueling pedigree to participate. You need to stand your ground and do your job in a line where everybody else is doing theirs. And honestly, that was the revelation. The French came with elite individuals. The Flemish answered with disciplined crowds. It's worth pausing on that word, disciplined. The myth says, peasants with sticks beat knights. But that's not what happened. It was townsmen and countryfolk trained to cooperate, drilled to hold ranks, and guided by leaders who understood terrain like a second language. The Godendag worked because it was part of a system, ditches and hedges to channel the charge, long pikes interlaced with shorter spikes, and a rhythm of stop the horse, strip the rider, crush the man. That rhythm won a day and altered a century. The aftermath echoed in metal. So many French knights died that the battlefield glittered with golden spurs, trophies of a class that had expected to take, not lose. Chroniclers seized on the image, and the name stuck. What changed wasn't just a single battle, it was the credibility of infantry against premium cavalry. From that point on, smart commanders treated even the most glorious horse charge like a tool, not a trump card. Let's get practical about the object itself. Surviving examples and depictions suggest variety. Some shafts, shoulder, height, others closer to chest, high. Some spikes pyramidal and stout for punching plate, others longer and more needle, like for mail and lighter barding. Weight sat forward, but not so far that a soldier couldn't recover the haft quickly after a set. You can imagine the drilling commands: brace, angle, take the weight, now step and strike. A whole street's worth of tradesmen could learn it in hours and improve it in weeks. That quick trainability mattered strategically. A city that can tool up 500 men in a month changes its political options. Suddenly guilds have leverage, literally and metaphorically. They can resist raids, deter foraging armies, and negotiate from something other than desperation. The weapon's low cost and fast production created a feedback loop. More units equipped, more units trained in formation, better field performance, more willingness to invest in the same simple kit. As complexity goes, it's beautifully boring, which is exactly what you want when lives depend on avoiding failure points. There's a psychological angle too. Knights cultivated a theatre of war banners, caparisons, heraldry, bright metal in the Sunday. The Godendag is anti-theatre. It reads like work. When 200 men shoulder those shafts and set them silently, they send a different kind of message. No duel, no dance, no pageant, just outcomes. Cavalry lost not only bodies at Kortrijk, it lost mystique. When the richest people in the field can be stopped by a timber with an iron tooth, the story they tell about themselves has to adjust. Does that mean the age of the horse ended overnight? Of course not. Good cavalry adapted, choosing ground more carefully, coordinating with archers and crossbowmen, probing for breaks instead of simply gambling on shock. But the automatic supremacy of heavy horse shattered, and that fracture line runs straight through a cheap, tough staff with a spike. If you're keeping score in our little arms race, the Warhammer punished armor's false promise. The flail punished neat defense. The Godendag punished momentum. 3 different ways of telling the battlefield, your plan has a blind spot. And each time, the winning side didn't just bring a weapon, they brought a way of fighting that made that weapon sing. It's also the moment to notice a theme. Leverage is king. The hammer leverages mass at the end of a haft. The flail leverages the extra angular speed of a free-swinging head. The Godendag leverages the ground itself. Your body becomes a brace. The soil your anchoring partner. The enemy's speed your power source. Medieval warfare is full of poetry when you want it, but under the banners, it's levers all the way down. Next, we leave the humble for the extravagant because not every answer to armor and mass was small or cheap. Some soldiers solved the problem by getting bigger, much bigger. 2 hands, 6 feet of blade, and a job description that reads, walk into a wall of spears, and make it not a wall. The Zweihänder, or its many regional cousins, wasn't just a sword. It was a portable demolition permit. Not every solution to plate armor and packed infantry was subtle. Some weren't even reasonable. Enter the Zweihänder, literally two-hander, a sword so large it looked like a blacksmith's dare that somehow made the final cut. We're talking 5 to 6 feet of steel, sometimes more, with a grip long enough for both hands and then some. You don't draw a Zweihänder to win a duel of finesse. You draw it to make a point, and also to unmake whatever is standing in front of you. The soldiers most famous for carrying these monsters were the Landsknechts, German mercenaries with flamboyant clothes and a practical attitude toward violence. Within their ranks, the biggest, strongest, and most disciplined wielders of the Zweihänder earned double pay, hence the nickname Doppelsöldner. Why double? Because their job description read like a workers' comp nightmare. Step out in front of your own pike block, run at the enemy's pike block, and break it. If you picture two hedgehogs ramming into each other, those hedgehog spines are 16-foot pikes. The Zweihänder man's role was to shear through those shafts, hook and wrench them aside, and open lanes for his comrades to flood through. It wasn't romantic. It was demolition with choreography. Design details tell you everything about the sword's purpose. Many battlefield Zweihänder blades include a ricasso, an unsharpened section just above the guard, often wrapped in leather so the user can choke up and handle the mass closer to the blade's center. That gives control at close quarters, like gripping farther up a shovel for accuracy. You'll also see parrying hooks or flukes sprouting near the ricasso. Little steel wings that catch pike shafts, bind enemy blades, or keep a glancing block from sliding down into your fingers. A gigantic cutter, yes, but also a tool for control. Slice, thrust, hook, shove. The Zweihänder is a Swiss army knife at a scale that borders on satire. All that spectacle hides a surprising truth. Effective use depended less on brute force than on flow. You don't swing a Zweihänder like an axe at a stump. You keep it moving. The weight becomes manageable when the blade lives in motion, big figure eights, traveling guards, cuts that lead naturally into the next guard without dead stops. Training drills teach you to carry momentum rather than fight it. Cut down and left, roll the wrists, float up into an overhead guard, cut down and right, step offline, wind into a thrust. Done right, it looks almost graceful, like a barn door learning ballet. Still, physics doesn't vanish. The swords most likely used in field combat tended to be lighter than parade pieces. Think 7 to 9 pounds rather than museum monster weights. But even that becomes a lot after a few minutes of work in armor under stress. Hence the specialization. Not every mercenary grabbed the biggest blade and became a formation breaker. The companies chose men who could sustain performance, who could keep guard shape after the third exchange instead of gassing out. Double pay wasn't just a perk, it was hazard bonus plus skill premium. On the receiving end, the Zweihänder's power was psychological before it was physical. Imagine holding a pike in a tight block, trusting the men on your left and right, and here comes a human windmill with 6 feet of sharpened argument. Even if the blade doesn't cut the shaft cleanly, and cutting pike wood in a single stroke is harder than legend suggests, the shock, the hook, the shove, and the step break spacing. A pike formation is only invincible when its spacing is perfect. Collapse that geometry, make men flinch, cross shafts, lose lane discipline, and the advantage evaporates in seconds. The Zweihänder was therefore as much about forcing mistakes as making kills. Cost and craft also mattered. A good Zweihänder wasn't cheap. Broad, long blades demand high-quality steel and expert heat treating, so the sword won't bend like licorice or shatter like glass. Hilts had to be robust, guards reinforced, tangs thick and well-peened. That price tag limited mass issue. Elite roles got the real tools. Ceremonial or civic guards often carried heavier, flashier versions, more for show than for field effectiveness. That's why museum cases dazzle with etched, gilded giants that likely marched in parades while their plainer, lighter cousins did the dirty work at the breach. Let's put the sword in its tactical ecosystem. The Landsknecht recipe borrowed from and competed with Swiss pike doctrine. Layered ranks of long spears, mixed in with halberds, sidearms, and yes, some two-handers. The Zweihänder specialists step out during the collision phase, the moment when two pike hedges grind, and no one can quite get the spear points properly set. In that claustrophobic slice of time, a long reach blade that can cut, bat, hook, or thrust is a nightmare. It doesn't need to mow people down like wheat. It just needs to turn an organized wall into individual men suddenly solving individual problems. Once that happens, the supporting halberdiers and swordsmen do the harvesting. We also see these swords shine in channel fights, breaches in city walls, gate mouths, narrow streets, ship decks. A long, intimidating blade with authority at 2 or 3 meters can hold multiple opponents at bay, especially when space prevents them from getting around your sides. If the battlefield is open, the Zweihänder relies on a team. In a choke point, the blade itself becomes the team. Counterplay existed, of course. Archers and crossbowmen harassed Doppelsöldner to blunt their advance. Pikemen learned to keep points low and fence the long sword's approach, rather than trying to meet its cuts high. Polyaxes punished overcommitted swings. And once gunpowder weapons matured, formation breaking took on a louder, smokier character. Even so, the Zweihänder didn't vanish overnight. Documented field use runs well into the early 17th century. In the age of powder, a long, confident blade still had jobs guarding standards, clearing ladders, scaring the courage out of men with less appetite for sharp, fast decisions. If there's a theme tying Warhammer, Flail, Godindag and Zweihänder together, it's this. The weapon isn't the whole story. The method makes the weapon matter. Put a Zweihänder in an undrilled hand, and you get theatre. Put it in a trained Doppelsöldner, with a pike block backing him, and a drummer keeping time, and you get outcomes. It's tempting to read these tools as pure offense, bigger, harder, louder, yet medieval combat also valued the opposite, control. Capture the rich man instead of killing him. And you don't just win, you profit. Not every battlefield problem calls for more holes. Some call for leverage at the end of a pole and a way to make someone in expensive armor go where you want him to. The next design is cruel in a different key. A collar instead of a blade, spikes that warn rather than kill, and a pole long enough to reach the mounted elite without joining them in the mud. Because sometimes the smartest weapon isn't the one that ends a fight. It's the one that turns your enemy into inventory. Killing ends a story. Capturing writes a sequel and sends an invoice. In a world where armor cost a townhouse and a noble name could unlock a small nation's treasury, medieval warfare had a cold calculus. A live enemy in expensive metal might be worth more than a dozen dead ones. Enter the man-catcher, a polearm that didn't ask your permission, only your neck. It's the rare medieval weapon whose primary function wasn't to spill blood, but to control it. Picture a stout wooden shaft long enough to keep you out of sword range, topped with a hinged metal collar. Think of a giant, D-shaped clamp with teeth or inward-pointing prongs. You slip that collar around a man's gorget, shoulder, or sometimes an arm, snap it shut, and twist. The spikes face inward, not to cut arteries, but to discourage the obvious response, yanking backward to escape. The design philosophy is grimly elegant. Hurt just enough to make resistance a bad idea, not enough to ruin the ransom value. Why build such a thing? Because medieval warfare rewarded restraint in very specific circumstances. A knight in full harness was a walking bond certificate. If you could bag him alive, you didn't just remove a blade from the battlefield, you minted money. Contemporary accounts are unashamed about it. Ransoms could equal years of tax revenue. Lesser nobles fetched sums that bought land, ships, or the kind of political favors that turned skirmishes into treaties. Armies even budgeted around the possibility, paying capture bonuses the way modern sales teams pay commissions. Tactically, the man-catcher shines in that awkward space where horses meet people. Mounted elites often counted on height, speed, and the psychological shock of a charge. The man-catcher answers with reach, timing, and leverage. You aren't wrestling a knight. You're snagging him at a vulnerable moment mid-pass, off balance, visor narrowed, then rotating his posture into failure. A shove on the pole turns his own armor into a pulley system that works against him. Once he's unhorsed, the same pole becomes a handle. Your team uses it to steer an armored body like a reluctant wardrobe toward friendlier ground. That last word, team, is important. Man-catchers rarely worked solo. Manuals and muster rolls hint at capture crews. One handler with the collar, one or two with shields and short weapons to fend off rescuers, and a couple more to secure the prize with cords or additional poles. It's choreography. Hook, twist, step back. Shield covers the approach lane. A partner loops a secondary strap. Everyone retreats in a tight clump while the line closes behind them. The handler's job isn't showy. It's patient, opportunistic, and brutally practical. You can see how armor trends nudged the tool's evolution. As visors improved and gorgets thickened, collars widened, and mechanisms got trickier. Some heads incorporated spring-loaded latches that tightened if the captive thrashed. Others used forked prongs with crossbars to prevent the pole from slipping upward toward the face. German variants tended to be longer, safer in the scrum around cavalry. Italian and Venetian guard models got clever with locks and ratchets, optimized for urban arrests where bystanders and stairwells complicate everything. That's right, man-catchers weren't just battlefield oddities. City watches liked them. In markets, alleys, and dockyards, you don't want wide blood arcs or random sword cuts. You want distance and control. A collar at arm's length keeps a brawler away from his dagger and makes 3 guards equal to 1 very surprised tough. The same goes for sieges and gate duty. When tempers flare and crowds press, a hook on a pole can pluck a ringleader out of a knot of bodies with far less risk than a blade swing. The economics explain the ethics such as they were. Medieval justice could be savage, but militaries and magistrates weren't sentimental about method when outcomes paid better. A dead rebel is an example. A live lord is a bank transfer. Even among equals on the field, there's a cold camaraderie to capture. Today's prisoner could be tomorrow's captor. Customs grew up around treating noble prisoners in a way that kept negotiations civilized and future ransoms possible. The man-catcher, impersonal and businesslike, fit that culture. Do your work. Do not make extra holes. Deliver a product. Of course, no design is perfect. Man-catchers had weaknesses. The collar needs access neck, shoulder, arm. A smart opponent presents edges, not openings. He rides with companions who swat at poles. He keeps his head mobile and his line tight. Some orders added armor features specifically to defeat capture-raised collars, flanges, and ridges that denied a clean clamp. Others targeted handlers on sight. If someone in the scrum is carrying what amounts to a mobile invoice, you erase him first. Training addressed some of this. Handlers drilled footwork obsessively. Approach on a shallow angle outside the weapon line. Present the collar, snap, then rotate away from the captive's strong side. The twist is the whole trick. A straight pull becomes a tug of war you might lose. A twist exploits the captive's rigid neck protection, using the cuirass as a pivot. Another drill teaches shelf and shove. Catch under the armpit instead of the neck, then lift and drive to unbalance the hips. Not as glamorous as a sword masterclass, but it's a craft and experienced crews got fast. There's a psychological layer we shouldn't ignore. Weapons shout messages before they sing. A man-catcher announces intentions that terrify and humiliate in equal measure. Knights cultivated identity through heraldry and deeds, being dragged by the throat like contraband cuts at that identity. Which is the point. Demoralization radiates. If the gilded man with the biggest plume is being yanked through mud by the municipal utility department, his friends start weighing probabilities instead of fantasies. Did the tool endure past plate and pikes? In quieter forms, yes. The logic control at a distance without lethal force never went out of style. Poles with Y-shaped forks, padded loops, and later steel catch poles show up in guard rooms and prisons for centuries. You even catch echoes in modern riot control gear and animal control poles. Less romance, same mechanical story. Reach, enclose, lever, restrain. Let's talk counters and failure cases. Because YouTube loves receipts, the man-catcher is not a win button. If the target sees it coming and has space, he steps through the circle before it closes, and you've offered him a gift, a lever attached to your center line. If you mistime the snap, he batters the collar aside with a shield boss or tramples the pole with his horse. If your team spacing is sloppy, you snag a man and then lose him to a well-aimed hook or dagger from his buddy. It's a tool, not a script. Still, the strategic math is lopsided. You don't need man-catchers everywhere. You need them where the value concentrates on the flanks where cavalry probes, at breaches where officers rally, near standards where nobles plant themselves for glory and, inconveniently, visibility. Sprinkle trained crews at those nodes, and a battle gets cheaper and more lucrative in the same hour. It's also telling how neatly the man-catcher fits the moral grey of medieval conflict. We're comfortable, narratively, with honourable combat and with bloody slaughter. The man-catcher lives in the ledger lines between them. It's mercenary compassion. Preserve the life that pays. Apply pain where it increases compliance. Call it mercy. Collect the fee. If that sounds cynical, it is, but it's also honest about what wars have always been. Contests of will conducted under budgets. There's a structural lesson too. Weapons that kill solve the immediate problem. Weapons that control create opportunities. A captured commander surrenders information. A paraded noble dissolves resistance. A ransom finances winter quarters. And unlike a blade whose only language is cut, the man-catcher speaks several dialects. Stop, separate, display, deliver. No wonder city councils and captains kept them in inventory long after more romantic hardware went out of style. So far we've toured 4 ways to bend battle to your will, crush the man in the can, bend the rules around the shield, turn a charge into a liability, and turn a fighter into a commodity. Our next stop abandons restraint and returns to nightmare. It looks like a morning star, feels like a sledge with teeth, and carries the kind of physics lesson that leaves doctors and priests equally busy. Where the man-catcher saves value, this one erases it with prejudice. A spiked sphere that doesn't care what you wear, only how loudly bones complain when force meets points. Get ready for the weapon that made even hardened soldiers flinch at its silhouette, the morning star. Some weapons whisper, the morning star doesn't. It shows you what it intends at a glance. A heavy orb studded with spikes fixed to a stout shaft and then keeps its promise. If a warhammer is about pressure, and a flail is about angles, the morning star is about points. Dozens of needle, fine contacts that focus your whole swing into cruelly small footprints. Nothing fancy, nothing subtle, just the shortest route from motion to damage. First, let's clear up a common mix-up. Pop culture often calls any spiked ball on a chain a morning star. In period sources, you'll find rigid haft versions, a spiked head mounted directly on a wooden or metal shaft, that are better candidates for the name, especially in Germanic regions, where Morgenstern is attested. The chain variant is a flail. The fixed one is our star of the hour. Why the distinction matters, a rigid haft gives control. In a crush of bodies, control beats theatrics every time. Design tells the story. Imagine a sphere the size of a grapefruit up to a small melon, cast or forged in iron, with spikes set into it like a hedgehog in a bad mood. The shaft can be one-handed for mounted use or longer for infantry. Balance leans forward enough headweight to deliver true authority, not so much that recovery becomes a prayer. The grip often wears iron bands near the head to keep a desperate opponent from chopping the weapon apart with a lucky cut. This isn't a gentleman's sidearm. It's a job site tool for breaking problems that wear helmets. Why spikes? Because pressure equals force divided by area. A hammer face spreads the blow and relies on transfer through armor to mush the human underneath. A morning star cheats. Each spike reduces contact area to a tiny cone. When the head lands, those cones don't need to carve a dramatic hole. They only need to pierce or deform enough to compromise the armor's integrity and transmit filthy amounts of energy into flesh and bone directly below. Plate that might shrug at a sword cut suddenly sprouts wells and punctures. Mail links designed to flex and distribute impact find themselves parted like zipper teeth. Quilted gambesons that cushion blunt force get stapled down to the ribs they were protecting. Surgeons of the day, barber chirurgeons with hands steadier than their world, write around this weapon without poetry. Wounds from spiked heads were unclean, ragged, deep, and often multiple. A single strike could plant half a dozen punctures around a crown of crush, producing bone flakes, embedded metal, and the kind of contamination that turned ordinary fever into funeral plans. You don't need a through and through to end a fight. A 2-centimeter puncture to a joint, a visor slit, or the collar gap will ruin a man's mechanics and his morale. Speaking of morale, the silhouette did half the work before the first swing. Soldiers looked across a line and, in the forest of spears and swords, the morning star stood out, brutal geometry that poked at the lizard brain. Commanders knew it. Put a file of these in the front rank, and enemy lines had a way of going from confident to cautious. Caution slows feet. Slow feet break charges. Broken charges make victories. Let's talk use, because this is where the morning star surprises people who assume it's just a caveman bludgeon with acne. The good ones don't wind up like cartoons. They travel in short, disciplined arcs. Mounted, you drive the head down and forward as your horse closes, using the height advantage to aim at faces, shoulders, and the top plates of helmets, places where spikes get purchase, and where even a glancing blow can snag and wrench. On foot, you keep the head moving in a tight loop from high guard, to diagonal cut to recovery across the body. If the blow lands on a shield, the spikes bite and pull. You use that bite to yank the shield down or sideways and step into the opening with the next beat. It's not just hit, it's hit and handle. Recovery matters more than most imagine. Dead-ending a heavy head wastes energy and opens you to counters. Trained users flow. The head rebounds off target or shield. The wrists roll to catch the rebound on the opposite guard. The feet adjust a half step to keep the line. That flow also protects your own fingers. Remember, a morning star doesn't glide off surfaces. It sticks. You have to anticipate that stick and build it into the next motion. Against plate, you're not hoping for Hollywood punctures center mass. You're aiming at systems, visor bars, vent holes, oculars, at borders, the gorget line, the inside elbow, the gauntlet cuff, at edges, the rim of a shield, the lip of a sallet. A spike that lances under a visor, or through a breath slit, ends arguments quickly. A spike that crush perforates an elbow means the owner's sword just got much lighter, and not in a good way. Armor didn't leave this unanswered. Later harnesses evolved bolder visors, sliding rondels, beefier gorgets, and cuff flanges that redirect glancing points. But metallurgy and carpentry have budgets. Spikes keep pace because they're cheap to sharpen and easy to lengthen. You can see the arms race in museum specimens, heads with fewer, longer spikes in regions where plate quality soared, heads with more, shorter spikes where lighter armors prevailed. The weapon iterates because the blacksmith can. How does the Morning Star compare to its cousins? Versus a mace? It trades a bit of reliability on flat impacts, for vastly better penetration on marginal angles. Versus a warhammer, it loses some precision but wins in crowd control. You don't need to hit exactly the hinge when half the head is made of little hinges of pain. Versus a flail, it gives up the curve-around trick in exchange for predictability, which teammates appreciate when inches separate friend and foe. In line fighting, predictability is a feature, not a bug. Training? Less exotic than a flail, more deliberate than just swing harder. Drill spends time on distance and on measured power, knowing exactly how hard you need to hit to stick when you want to yank, and when not to stick, when you need to recover. Fast. Cavalry practice includes timing off the horse's cadence, rise on the beat, drop the head on the down stride, so the mount's motion adds free kinetic energy without pulling you out of your seat. Infantry practice layers in shield work. How to catch a shield rim with the spikes and step to wrench it. How to break a spear haft with a diagonal cut. How to transition to a thrust with the top spike. Many heads sport a pronounced central point when a lane opens. Counters exist, and they're worth knowing. Shields aren't helpless. A forward-tilted board grazes the head up and away, forcing the spikes to slide rather than bite, buying you a step to the outside. Polearms punish overreach, present a half-staff to intercept the incoming arc, and you kill the star's speed 2 feet before impact. And footwork, always footwork, denies the weapon its sweet spot. Get in too close and you smother the head, fight at the extreme tip, and you make the wielder chase air. The star loves mid-range. Don't live there. Still, in the ugly truth of melee, the Morning Star shines because it solves problems fast. An enemy shield wall feels steady until a few boards rip down and helmets dent in the space of 3 heartbeats. A mounted knight trusts his visor until something rattles through it. A line thinks it can grind forward. Then the first rank shows holes, men behind hesitate, and momentum leaks out the sides. That's the star's real gift. Not the individual kill, but the chain of hesitation it inflicts. Aesthetically, the weapon bled into iconography. Artists paint angels with spiked clubs smiting demons. Municipalities stick spiked heads on poles as civic warnings. Preachers co-opt the name Morning Star for Venus and for metaphors, while soldiers wink at the irony. You don't have to like the poetry to respect the marketing. The shape became shorthand for punishment. To this day, if you sketch a stick with a spiked ball, anybody in any culture knows you're not doodling a plough. So where do we go after a device that turns geometry into dread? We go from points back to leverage, to a polearm that puts a hammer, a spike, and a spear on the same chassis and asks you to pick the right language for the armor in front of you. If the Morning Star is pure offense distilled, the next design is options distilled. Curved beak for plate seams, flat face for concussive persuasion, a thrusting spike up top when distance demands a straight line. Meet the raven that pecks through steel, the bec de Corbin. If the morning star is a sentence with a single exclamation point, the bec de Corbin French for raven's beak is a paragraph with punctuation to spare. Hammer on one cheek, wicked down-curved beak on the other, and often a thrusting spike on top, all mounted on a long haft. One head, 3 languages: crush, pierce, stab. On a battlefield where armor was a moving puzzle and ranges changed by the heartbeat, the ability to pick the right verb for the right moment is power. Start with the beak itself. Curved downward and tapered to a hard point, it's not a sewing needle. It's a pry bar with a talon. You don't just poke. You set the tip where plate curves away collar seams, visor rims, armpit gaps, the inside line of an elbow, and then you drive with the whole body. Because the head sits at the end of a lever 5 to 7 feet long, even a modest human becomes a menace. Leverage multiplies force. The tiny contact area multiplies pressure. The result is a sound that medieval writers noticed even in chaos. A screech, thunk as steel complains, and then something under it gives way. The beak doesn't need to drill a cartoon hole. It needs to deform a plate, part a mail weave, or bite a seam so you can wrench. Flip the shaft, and you meet the hammer face flat or slightly peened. Think of it as the conversation starter. Sometimes a plate is too proud. You humble it. A brisk hammer kiss dents a pauldron, so the next strike lands cleaner. It can stun through armor, brains don't care if the shell stayed intact, break bones beneath, and collapse shields that would simply glance off a blade. Against lighter kit jack and mail, kettle hats, wooden targe, the hammer side is a thesis on Newton. Then there's the top spike. It's the polearm's honest handshake, a straight-line threat for straight-line problems. A man steps in with a spear, answer with your own thrust. The press opens a lane down center. Thread the needle before it closes. On ramparts and ladders, when distance warps and angles flatten, that top spike is how you tell the world you still own the vertical. What makes the bec de Corbin sing is the switching. You don't carry 3 tools, you carry one head that swivels consequences. A trained fighter doesn't decide which face to use in the moment. The geometry decides. Shield rim presents, hook the beak, yank down, and let a teammate step through. Gorget flashes at an awkward angle. Flip to hammer and ring it like a bell, then feed the beak into the stagger. Pike half trapped across your hip, half slide your grip, and spike straight down the lane. It's not flash, it's flow. Let's talk handling, because the pole length spooks people who imagine unwieldy barn poles. Good shafts are ash or oak, grain straight, weight slightly forward of center. You hold it like a staff. Lead hand near the balance point, rear hand back to add engine. Movement lives in half steps and pivots, bringing the head to the target instead of dragging the target to the head. The weapon rewards clean lines. If you windmill, you're late. If you try to muscle through from a dead stop, you're slower than a gentleman with a dagger and better footwork. The Corbin secret is small circles, tight chambers, quick snaps, immediate recoveries. Training looks like this. Hours of posting the beak onto exact coins of target visor edge, gorget seam, the polygon of a cowter without skidding, hours of hammer beats on a pell to learn what a dent feels like through the hands. Hours of threading the top spike through rings at different heights while someone shoves your shoulder from the side. Then integration drills. Beak hook, half turn, hammer, step, spike, retreat. The point isn't muscle. It's timing that turns muscle into inevitability. Compare it to cousins. Versus a halberd, the Corbin gives up an axe blade's broad cut, but it gains a beak that bites armor with less wasted energy, and a hammer that's kinder to your own wrists on impacts. Versus a polyaxe, it's a sibling rivalry. Regional naming and variations blur the line, but the Corbin family tends to emphasize the beak's geometry for armor picking, where some polyaxes stay more hatchet forward. Against a pure spear, the Corbin loses a bit of reach and thrust speed, but wins a grab bag of finishing options the moment lines tangle. On the receiving end, knights felt the intent baked into the silhouette. A sword can be parried, a mace can be smothered. A beak that aims at the neck seam carries insult. The smith who made it studied your armor and designed a rebuttal. That gets in heads before it gets under helmets. Psychologically, you're not just facing a heavy stick, you're facing a man with a can opener labeled with your name. Armor fought back, of course. Gorgets thickened and grew rolls to redirect the beak. Sliding rondels, those little steel saucers on lances and arming swords, show up more often at vulnerable joints. Elbow cops sport bigger wings. Helmet visors borrow grill bars and spring pins to reinforce breathers and oculars. But each defensive flourish costs weight and money, and the Corbin's answer costs a few hours at the anvil shaping a curve sharper, or tempering a tip harder. In that economic tug-of-war, the beak side often wins on budget. The team game is where the weapon turns battles. Imagine a line fight. Front rank with long spears holds the enemy at measure. Behind them, Corbin men float between files. A shield pops up too high, beak pulls it down. A pike tip threatens your front hammer, bats it aside. Your spearman surges to fill the lane. A knight's shoulder turns to angle through top spike, sows him to the moment long enough for a friend to stitch a follow-up. The Corbin isn't only a killer, it's a problem maker, and problem makers are force multipliers. Urban fights and siege ladders amplify those gifts. In a breach barely wide enough for two men, the beak is an eviction notice. Hook helmet, twist, dump. On parapets, the top spike punishes anyone who rises to throw a stone or tip a cauldron. In stairwells, the hammer does awful work, short strokes, low ceilings, nowhere to roll with the blow. The same versatility that picks at plate also clears corners and denies doorways. Not glamorous, extremely effective. Manufacture deserves a nod. The Corbin head is a Smith's test. You must harden the striking faces enough to keep from mushrooming, but temper the socket and cheeks so they don't crack when a bad hit lands wrong. Many heads wear langets, strips of metal running down the shaft to armor the wood from cuts. The socket rivets need love. A head that wiggles is a head that wanders. This isn't hobby work. It's pro gear, and good cities invested in it the way modern departments invest in quality breaching tools. Because that's what a Corbin is, a medieval breacher, minus the hinges and drywall. Counters? Plenty. Don't live at its optimal band mid-range, where the head can accelerate and still control the hit. Spearmen punish Corbins by jabbing at hands, not heads. Shields work if you keep them forward and tilted, forcing the beak to glance while you step inside the arc. Half-swording, gripping your own blade halfway along to use it like a short spear, lets longsworders stab wrists and armpits before the hammer can cycle. And nothing ruins a polearm's day like angles. Two fighters stepping to opposite sides force the wielder to commit across his own center, the slowest turn in the book. That said, every counter demands composure. A Corbin's other weapon is panic. One more layer. Ethics by economics. The man-catcher we just met monetizes prisoners. The Corbin monetizes moments. Every dent you put into elite armor lowers the cost of finishing that opponent by you or by the cheaper spear behind you. Every hook you land creates a 2-second sale window for your line. Medieval captains didn't think in spreadsheets, but their instincts were retail savvy. Create openings your teammates can convert. The Corbin is a conversion machine. Legacy? It lingers. Even as black powder changes the conversation, polearms that mix pry, punch and poke remain useful in guards, city watches, and places where blades aren't subtle enough. You see echoes in modern breaching and rescue tools. Crow's beaks and Halligan bars that pry, hammer faces that smack, spikes that test and puncture. Swap oak for fiberglass and iron for alloy, and the logic is unchanged. Lever plus point plus face equals options on demand. So far, our tour has lived at arm's length. Physics you can feel in your wrists. But medieval engineers weren't content with wrists. They wanted range, the ability to end a life that couldn't hit back in the same minute. If plate turned men into turtles, one answer was to reach over the shell entirely. Crossbows hinted at it. Then came their big, ugly cousins, torsion engines that flung bolts like javelins hurled by giants. If everything we've covered so far is about what a strong pair of wrists can do, the ballista is what happens when engineers decide wrists are for amateurs. Think of it as a crossbow that ate its vegetables, lifted stones for fun, and then demanded a crew and a firing position with good sightlines. It's not subtle. It's also not fair. At least not to anyone who believed distance should equal safety. Let's get the picture straight. A classic ballista uses torsion bundles of twisted sinew, hair, or rope trapped in rigid frames to store energy. Through those bundles run two short arms, like stumpy bow limbs, connected to a central slider that draws back a thick string along a track. Wind the winch, twist those bundles tighter, lock the catch, and you've got coiled rage in a wooden chassis. Release, and the arms snap forward, dragging the string and hurling a shot downrange with a flat, terrifying trajectory. What does it shoot? That's where the ballista flexes. The signature round is the bolt more like a short spear than an arrow tipped for penetration and heavy enough to keep its line in rough weather. But crews also fired barbed heads to snag shield faces, broadheads to mangle rigging and siege gear, and even simple iron darts when quantity beat elegance. Different theatres experimented with stone shot, though that job usually passed to catapults and, later, trebuchets. The ballista's genius is precision at ranges where a longbow starts to arc like a rainbow and hope. You aim at a man, you hit a man, or the man 2 men behind him. Why did medieval armies bother with these complicated beasts when bows and crossbows were cheaper? 3 reasons. Reach, line, psychology. Reach is obvious, you can hurt people who aren't hurting you back. Line is the part soldiers learn the hard way. Unlike arrows that describe gentle curves you can sort of watch, a ballista bolt flies memorably flat. One moment your captain is yelling about intervals, the next he's on the ground making peace with his choices, a yard of timber arguing through his ribcage. And psychology, well, spending a day inside a fortification under ballista fire is a masterclass in dread. You can see archers, you can dodge arcs, you can time volleys. A ballista's tempo is slower, but each shot feels like a coin flip with your name on it. The crews, for their part, grow into the role quiet, efficient, almost priestly. They bring a ritual to war. Crank, latch, load, sight, breathe, clack. When they're good, 2 or 3 engines stitch lanes across approaches that cavalry suddenly doesn't want to ride. Placement matters as much as build. Field ballistae sit on swiveling carriages that let crews traverse quickly and cover gaps between infantry blocks. In sieges, you'll see them on towers, gatehouses, and purpose-built platforms, anywhere a clean horizon gives the machine a chance to harvest officers, standard-bearers, sappers, and anyone unlucky enough to be conspicuous. Against ships, ballistae target masts, steering gear, and clustered marines. Against siege engines, they pick at wheel hubs and crew chiefs until the lumbering beasts stall, then die under fire. Let's talk handling. Because the machine has a learning curve that separates hobbyists from dangerous professionals. Winding the string to the catch isn't just grunt work. Uniformity matters. Uneven tension in the torsion bundles tilts the arms and sends shots wandering. Crews mark their winch turns, count strokes aloud, and feel for the point where the bundle's resistance stiffens symmetrically. Loading the bolt requires choreography and close-quarters fingers out of the track. Thumbs off the string, no poet in the crew who thinks rules are suggestions. Then aiming, elevation by ratchet, traverse by shoulder and hip, and fine adjustment by breath. The best gunners learn to watch wind from flags and smoke, not from wishful thinking. Rate of fire? Faster than you'd guess and slower than you want. A dialed-in crew can manage 2 to 4 bolts per minute on the medium engines. Smaller cart-mounted types think mobile harassment platform go quicker. The massive torsion queens that anchor siege lines work like artillery. One beautiful, ruinous shot. Then a reset that eats a half minute and a lot of muscle. It's not spray and pray. It's place and punish. Counterplay exists, and smart defenders invest in it. Screens rawhide and layered wicker soak a surprising amount of energy and can foul bolt heads before they find soft humans. Mantlets on wheels let sappers creep, while mobile cover absorbs incoming. Crews wear pavises like turtle shells when they move between tasks. At the strategic level, counter-battery fire is very much a thing. Spot the enemy engine's muzzle flash, a slap of light off iron, a certain creak and snap, then drown it in arrows, or roll a stone thrower into line and erase the position. Night shoots help too. Ballistae are line-of-sight killers. Darkness steals their confidence even if the math stays the same. You'll hear people call ballistae snipers, and the metaphor holds, with caveats. They're more designated marksmen than lone assassin, still a team, still loud, still visible, but absolutely capable of targeted harm. A commander can point at a banner and say, "Drop it." And a minute later the banner drops. He can say, "Break that ladder," and it breaks, rhythm of ascent collapsing into screams and splinters. A good ballista line doesn't just bleed the enemy, it shapes behavior, forcing crouches where there should be sprints, dispersal where there should be mass, hesitation where there should be resolve. Mechanically, there's something beautiful about a mature ballista. The torsion bundles greasy, wrapped, always threatening to unmake themselves sit like muscles. The slider runs in grooves burnished by thousands of shots. The trigger, big, simple, overbuilt, confesses a design philosophy. Failure should be obvious and fixable. If a bowstring frays, you replace it. If a bundle dries, you soak it. If a limb splits, the carpenters swear, then fix it with lashings until the smith arrives. This is battlefield engineering, not academic perfection. The machine has to forgive mistakes and keep working in rain, dust, and fear. There's also a supply conversation lurking behind every thunk. Bolts are consumables. Good ones, straight shafts, hardened tips, proper fletching when used take time. Crews husband premium rounds for premium targets and feed cheaper sticks to less dignified problems. Quartermasters, meanwhile, count wood the way bakers count flour. A siege can burn through hundreds of bolts a day. Campaigns bog down when wagons of shafts lag behind. This is the unglamorous gravity that drags on grand strategy. Can you keep the big crossbows fed? What about the men in front of the machine? They learn a new set of instincts. Don't silhouette yourself on a wall. Don't bunch under a banner. Don't stand still to point when yelling works almost as well. The existence of ballistae teaches armies to behave differently. That's a quiet revolution. New weapons don't just kill, they discipline. If you're keeping the through line from our earlier chapters, the ballista belongs to a family of answers to the same question. How do we turn our opponent's strengths into liabilities? Against armor, we used pressure points and leverage. Against shields, we used weird angles. Against horses, we turned momentum against itself. Now, against distance, we weaponize distance, make over there the most dangerous part of the map. And just as the warhammer spawned counter-hammers in armor design, the ballista spawns counter-habits in human design. You can see the dialectic at work, bolt by bolt. Still, even this sniper sits in the shadow of bigger cousins. The ballista excels at punching people and small structures with precision. But what if you need to swat whole sections of wall? What if you'd like the enemy to think about surrender before breakfast? Medieval engineers, unsatisfied with big arrows, built a creature that doesn't care who you are, what you wear, or where you stand. It doesn't shoot you. It moves buildings with rocks, carcasses, barrels of terror, and the kind of kinetic poetry that makes masons weep. We're about to meet the lighter, quicker stinger that made officers duck and ladders fall the scorpion, and then the monarch of medieval artillery, the machine that turned stone into a verb, the trebuchet. If the ballista is the big-shouldered bouncer who clears a room with presence, the scorpion is the fast, quiet professional who walks in, picks a face in the crowd, and drops it. Same family, torsion engines, different personality. Where the ballista trades on mass and intimidation, the scorpion bets everything on speed, accuracy, and tempo, the holy trinity of making important people keep their heads down. Mechanically, it's elegant. Instead of one giant frame with thick arms, a scorpion runs twin torsion, bundles two vertical drums of twisted sinew or hair, pinching a short throwing arm between them, like a tiny catapult limb mounted sideways. A slider bed guides a thin dart, think oversized crossbow bolt, slimmer than a ballista quarrel, while a windlass hauls the string to the sear. Release. And the little arm snaps forward with a whip-fast motion that flings the dart on a line flatter than most longbows can dream of. It's the difference between lobbing and pointing. That flat shot is the scorpion's signature. Arrows telegraph their arrival. You can see the flock and maybe flinch in time. Scorpion darts are rude. They do not negotiate. They appear as if the air forgot to be empty, and then remember by punching through a shield, a throat, or the man who had a name this morning. On walls, that means officers duck when they should be directing. In the field, standard bearers go missing mid-gesture. Against ladders, rungs sprout darts, climbers fall, and everyone below learns to stare at their boots. Crews make the magic possible. A good team runs like a kitchen. One stringer manages the windlass, counting pulls. A loader seats the dart and checks the knock. A gunner sights and calls the shot. A coverman watches for counterfire. Scorpions forgive fewer mistakes than ballistae because their parts are lighter and faster. You do not get to be sloppy with fingers around a track whose moving bits behave like a mousetrap with an anger problem. Drills teach muscle memory. Hands clear by this count. Sear check on that breath. Loose on the gunner's call only. When crews hum, a modest field scorpion can spit 6 to 10 darts per minute in short bursts, less if you're nursing bundles, more if adrenaline outruns wisdom. Why the speed ceiling? Torsion heats. Twisting sinew stores energy well, but friction and rapid cycling make the bundles warm and dry. Crews keep oil and water, close oil to keep the string and sliders happy, water to keep the bundles from becoming jerky. Overwinding is the other risk. Greedy tension gives you one glorious shot followed by a cracked limb or a burst lashing that turns your engine into a thrashing snake. Veterans know the feel of correct draw. Firm, not brutal, symmetrical, not skewed. They mark the windlass with notches, count aloud, and check both arms for equal return. Accuracy gives the scorpion its strategic bite. A commander can point that archer nest, that signalman, that sapper at the foot of the wall, and odds are good the dart speaks to that person directly. Targets of choice. Men with feathers or cloaks, officers. Men with drums or horns, signals. Men carrying big shields for others, pavis crews. Any poor soul leaning out to throw a grappling hook or aim a handgun. In naval clashes, scorpions pick helmsmen, topmen on the rigging, and anyone lighting slow match near powder. The effect is larger than the body count. If the few people who make an army move can't lift their heads, the army hesitates. Waiting death is what some chroniclers call the mood scorpions create on ramparts. It's the hours-long strain where a man knows something lethal can intersect his day from far away without warning. He can't see the shooter. He can't influence the shot. He can only behave differently, crawl instead of stand, pause instead of reach, peek instead of supervise. Multiply that across a wall, and suddenly the defender's best asset organized response turns into a jittery trickle of late reactions. That's the scorpion's superpower. Not how many it kills, but who it silences and when. Mobility is another advantage. Scorpions ride light carriages or tripod mounts. 2 men can drag one, 4 can run with it. In a field fight, that means you can redeploy between files, angle into an exposed flank, or shadow your own advancing line to keep enemy skirmishers uneasy. In sieges, you can scamper a scorpion from tower to tower, popping up in new windows like a malicious whack-a-mole. Even when bolts miss, the pattern here, then there, then somewhere else entirely keeps heads down and eyes the wrong way when the assault actually starts. Ammunition types tell you what commanders asked scorpions to do. Standard darts are slim, heavy enough to stay on track, and tipped to defeat shields and light armor. Barbed heads make withdrawals expensive. Pull them out, and you pull out tissue. Broadheads chew rope, canvas, and thin timber. Good for sabotaging hoardings or ladder lashings. Occasionally you see incendiary wrappings. Tow smeared with pitch. Lit just before the shot to harass thatch or scare crews. Accuracy helps here. A burning dart that actually hits a stack of faggots under a hoarding does more than impress the skyline. Countermeasures evolved quickly because nobody enjoys being ventilated. Mantlets, portable shield walls on wheels roll into place, giving work parties a moving horizon of safety. Wicker screens draped with wet hides soak and deflect, catching darts like giant catcher's mitts. Defenders build blindages, angled roofs of timber and earth that let men move along a wall unseen. In the field, behavior shifts. No bunching under banners, no lecturing from horsebacks on rises, no standing tall on crests to look brave. Officers learn to point from cover, or better yet to delegate and keep the talking short. There's a telling doctrinal change when scorpions are in play. Assaults go in under noise and smoke horns, drums, bonfires, burning pitch to drown the gunner's cues, and degrade sightlines. Skirmish screens push closer, not farther, because the best answer to accurate torsion fire is to make its shots dangerous to its own side. Meanwhile, counter-battery teams with longbows or crossbows don't try to kill the whole crew. They aim for the gunner and the stringer, the 2 men whose absence cripples the cycle. A dead body on the carriage also blocks traverse. It's grim, but battle improvises. Despite the cool factor, scorpions aren't invincible. They hate rain, sinew swells, timing shifts, mud, carriages bog, and panic, which turns careful loading sequences into finger loss events. Their darts are consumables. Supply lines matter. If a siege eats through 1,000 darts in a few days and the wagon train lags, your engine becomes an expensive table. Good captains ration premium darts, straight shafts, hardened heads for premium tasks, and feed rougher ammo to lesser jobs like harassment. One reason the Scorpion's story endures is how clearly it shows the loop we've been following. Weapon counter new behavior. The Scorpion appears. Armies build screens and learn not to silhouette. Screens appear. Scorpion crews pick edges and wait for mistakes. Everyone gets smarter under stress. You can measure that intelligence by the silence between shots. The longer it stretches, the more somebody is thinking instead of merely firing. For all its precision, though, the Scorpion still lives in the shadow of a monarch. It is a scalpel where the next machine is a sledge. It teaches discipline where the next teaches despair. The Scorpion makes men duck. The trebuchet makes cities lean. If torsion engines are muscles, the trebuchet is a bone, a lever so big it turns gravity itself into a weapon. Where the Scorpion dots eyes in blood, the trebuchet erases paragraphs. So take a breath. Step back from the rail. The next chapter is going to shake the earth under your feet, knock masonry into memories, and show how medieval engineers took a simple childhood trick weight on one side, seesaw on the other, and scaled it until walls, towers, and courage all discovered their breaking points. If torsion engines are muscles, the trebuchet is skeleton, pure lever, pure inevitability. No twisted sinew, no bow to snap. Just a long arm, a heavy counterweight, a sling that knows a secret, and gravity doing what it does every day, only louder. Watching one work resets your sense of scale. It is the moment medieval war stops being about men and starts being about mass. Start with the bones. A trebuchet's heart is a pivoting beam, short arm on one side, long arm on the other, mounted on a stout axle frame. Hang a counterweight from the short arm, either a fixed block or a hinged box that swings freely. To the long arm, tie a sling, 2 cords and a pouch that cradles the projectile. Crew hauls the long arm down with ropes and a winch. The counterweight rises, the sling is loaded, and a release pin at the arm's tip controls the exact instant the sling lets go. Pull the trigger. The counterweight drops, the beam whips, the sling lengthens the arc, and if that pin is bent just so the stone leaves on a clean, high line. It's a playground seesaw possessed by an engineer. 2 flavors existed. Traction trebuchets, earlier, lighter, use people as the counterweight. Dozens of soldiers on ropes yank the short arm down, flinging the stone with synchronized sprints. Quick to build, hungry for labor, good for harassing walls and scaring garrisons that thought they were too far to matter. Then come counterweight trebuchets, the celebrity kind. Replace human backs with a box full of rock or lead, and you get consistency, scale, and the kind of force that turns crenellations into memory foam. Numbers feel different when you stand near the frame. A box the size of a wardrobe drops a few meters. The long arm can be 4, 5, even 6 times the length of the short arm. That ratio magnifies angular speed at the sling end. The sling itself, humble, overlooked, is the magic. It adds effective length at the moment of release, sharpening the launch angle and smoothing the acceleration so the projectile doesn't tumble out like laundry. Medieval crews fuss over that release pin angle because a single degree means hit the wall versus sail the wall versus kiss the field in front and bounce stupidly. On a good team, a pin gets tweaked after each shot like a guitarist tuning between songs. Rate of fire won't impress anyone raised on clips and magazines. Big engines manage a couple of stones every few minutes, but trebuchets trade rate for certainty. The beam cycles, the box groans, the sling snaps, then a block the weight of a family table floats for a heartbeat and arrives like a verdict. Crews develop a choreography. Winch team hauls the arm down, box team checks latches and weight, ammo team muscles the stone, gunner sights along a plumb line and checks wind with a streamer, captain calls the drop. When it works, the shot sounds like the earth sneezing. What do you throw? Stones, obviously rounded if the quarry's kind, squared if you want edges that bite. But besiegers get creative, because war is theatre as much as physics. Firepots, earthen jars of pitch or quicklime turn impact into splash damage. Barrels filled with smaller stones explode into shrapnel clouds that make wall tops unhealthy. Dead things, animal carcasses. Sometimes human heads aren't just terror. They're biology, pressure on morale and the water supply. You can argue the ethics during peacetime. At a siege, commanders argue effect. Walls answer, and the conversation is fascinating. Medieval builders learn to thicken curtains, pack rubble behind facing stones to absorb blows, and add buttresses that break long expanses into shorter, stronger bays. They build hoardings, wooden galleries out over the wall to shelter defenders and throwers. They wet hides, hang mantlets, and stack gabions, baskets of earth, to give sappers and crossbowmen places to breathe. They also raid. Sally ports discreet doors at ground level let brave teams dash out with hooks and fire to sabotage engines under cover of night. A trebuchet is a big, wooden promise. It's also flammable. Counter-battery fire is very real. Defenders roll out their own engines to answer. Trebuchet versus trebuchet fights become duels of geometry, spotting each other's range ladders and trying to wreck frames or, more often, slaughter crews. The simplest anti-engine tactic works too. Force the besieger to move. A trebuchet hates relocation. It's planted on leveled ground, guyed with ropes, framed with carpentry that wants to stay square. Shift the line, and you lose precious hours re-leveling and rebuilding while defenders sleep a little easier. Behind the theatre sits a ledger. Trebuchets are logistics with a sling. They want timbers long and straight enough to be a problem in any forest. They want iron for pins and shoes. They want rope and leather that don't snap when soaked. And they demand stone, lots of it cut, hauled, staged, and rolled into place. A siege isn't just soldiers. It's oxen, carpenters, blacksmiths, quarriers, teamsters, stake planters, rope splicers, cooks who keep those people standing, and officers who can count to tomorrow. The engine's boom is the easy part. Feeding its hunger is strategy. Accuracy matters more than legend admits. The image is random wrecking, but good crews walk shots in. First stone, short and left. Pin bends a hair, box weight adjusted by a few rocks, sling length retied a finger's breadth. Second stone, kisses the parapet. Third, through the merlon, into the wall walk, and men scatter because now the engine is not somewhere out there. It's drawing a line in space that intersects where they stand. After 10 shots, the wall's face looks like a rotten tooth. After 30, a breach begins. Stones fall out as gravity suddenly remembers the missing mortar. Assault troops are already lacing sandals and chalking hands. Defenders aren't passive in that approach to inevitability. They backfill with timbers, wedge supports behind the face, stack spare stone in arches so the outer layer can crack while the inner core holds. They send crossbow screens to harass crews between cycles and gunnery teams with early handguns to blind and burn. They decoy dummy positions for your engine to waste shots on. And always they look for wet nights and restless winds that make bowstrings sag, sling cords misbehave, and trigger crews cautious with cold fingers. The psychology of the trebuchet is its own siege. People who can stomach arrows find themselves unnerved by architecture moving. A wall is supposed to be an answer. It becomes a question. The sound teaches dread. The long creak of the winch, the sudden whump as the counterweight hits, the soft impossible hiss of a huge stone cutting air, the crack that follows 3 heartbeats later. Defenders learn that sound sequence the way sailors learn waves. Which ones matter, which ones mean duck, which ones mean not here but soon. From the builder's side, the engine is also pride. Master carpenters carve discreet marks on timbers, smiths stamp initials into iron shoes, quiet signatures on a public instrument. Teams name their engines with jokes and threats. When a shot drops a corner tower, cheers ripple all the way back to the cook fires. It is ugly work, but it is also craft, and craft wants witnesses. Is it unbeatable? No machine is. Weather kills torsion engines, mud kills wheels, fire kills wood. The trebuchet's specific kryptonite is time. If a garrison can stretch the calendar, repairs at night, sorties at dawn, negotiations at noon, winter or relief armies or disease may change the equation before the wall does. That's why smart besiegers combine engines with everything else. Saps and mines to attack foundations, ladders and towers to threaten elsewhere, bribery and letters to split a city's factions. The trebuchet is king, but kings win by coalitions. Take one more look at the mechanism now that you know how it thinks. Counterweight drops. That's stored potential energy coming due. Arm pivots. That's a lever taking a tiny fall and turning it into a long swing. Sling opens. That's a release tuned so precisely that a pebble of metal on a pin decides whether men die at a gate or a courtyard. There's poetry in that precision, even when the stanza ends in masonry dust. We've come a long way from a hammer that bullies plate at handshake distance to a lever that bullies stone at singing distance. 2 chapters remain, and they'll braid the threads we've followed. The last look at how weapons and tactics co-evolved at the edges of the medieval world. and what all this invention says about people who lived, worked, and feared under banners we romanticize too easily. Before we close, we'll step back to the ground level again, into the crush where spikes, hooks, and halves decide seconds, and then forward to the threshold where powder begins to rewrite the script these machines perfected. After watching stones edit skylines, it's tempting to think medieval war was just machines and nobles in tin. But most fights still came down to what happened inside arm's length, that loud, human zone where breath, boots, and bad decisions decide futures. This is where the middle children of medieval weapons ran the show. Poleaxes and halberds, the practical cousins of the bec de Corbin, born for the press, trained for the breach, and perfected for the moment when tidy formations dissolve into solvable problems. Let's disentangle the family. A halberd is the extrovert, axe blade on one side, top spike for thrust, and a rear hook, or beak, for pulling riders or yanking shields. Tall, often man height, or more balanced slightly forward, and happiest when it has a little runway to accelerate. The poleaxe is the introvert with impeccable manners, usually shorter, about the wielder's height, with a compact axe or hammer face, a stout top spike, and a squared beak opposite built to work in tight quarters, where you post a guard with your left hand halfway up the haft and write sentences in steel with your right. Both share a backbone of ash or oak, langets banding the shaft to resist cuts, and heads tempered so the striking faces stay honest, while the socket flexes instead of snapping. If you've watched our Ravensbeak friend make armor miserable, you already know why these two thrive. They're option machines. A halberd meets a shield, slide the hook over the rim, yank, and the shield either drops or opens a flank for your neighbor. A knight turns a shoulder to angle through the line. Axe blade kisses the pauldron and drives him sideways. Top spike follows into the seam you just created. A spearman's point snakes toward you. Bat it off with the axe cheek and answer with a straight thrust. The poleaxe plays the same grammar at closer range. Post the haft like a short staff, half staff to shorten the lever in tight space. Then pick verbs hammer to stun, beak to pick, spike to end. In a stairwell or breach, a well-run poleaxe is a thesis on geometry. Here's the secret that separates guy with stick from line that wins. Rolls. Medieval infantry didn't throw every tool forward at once. They layered jobs. Pikemen or long spears own first contact and distance. Right behind them float halberds, finishers, hunting mistakes the front rank creates. Poleaxes and swords with bucklers lurk in the second and third ranks. Surgeons ready to step through tiny doors that open for half a breath when a pike point lands, a shield dips, or a rider falters. Think of it like a kitchen line. Spears are the grill, halberds the sauté, poleaxe is the plating station. Everyone has a tempo. The dish is victory. When it hums, it looks inevitable. When it doesn't, it's spilled soup. Training builds that inevitability. Drills sound dull on parchment. In practice, they are music. Measure first. How far your head lands from your lead toe. How much step you need for the beak to bite without overreaching. Cadence next. A 3-beat loop set, strike, recover that keeps heads moving and gaps closed. Then transitions. Hook to step, step to cut, cut to thrust, thrust to back, weighted guard with the shaft vertical as a quick wall. Units practice call and answer maneuvers. Front rank feints left, halberds hook right, pikes lower, poleaxes pass through, break, reset, swap files. The point isn't to look pretty, it's to make options feel automatic when lungs burn and vision narrows. Armor didn't die in this world, it adapted. You see deeper cuffs on gauntlets to shrug off beaks, broader side plates on helmets to redirect hooks, more generous folds, those skirt plates, to deny easy entry. But you also see line soldiers learning the ethics of enough. Not every engagement is a kill. Sometimes you dent a visor to blind a man long enough for your neighbor to end him. Sometimes you hook a shield just to peel a lane for a spear. Sometimes you ring a helm with the hammer face, not to break the skull but to break the plan, and in a line fight, a broken plan is already half a casualty. Mounted opponents forced specific habits. A halberd's rear hook is not a grappling fantasy, it's a lever. You don't snare a galloping knight. You meet him as he slows at a hedge or bog, or you catch his second beat after he's tangled in men. Hook, twist the hips, step back, let the horse's body become your engine. The poleaxe plays clean-up, short strokes under the arm, rising spike to the gorget, hammer face to the visor. Cavalry learned to respect hedges and ditches, not only because of pikes, but because of what waited inside the hedge once the charge lost teeth. Then there's the breach fight where these tools become unfair. Imagine a hole punched by stones and saps, jagged, 2 men wide, ankle deep in grit. Ladders scrape, stones fall. Shouting has turned from brass to gravel. Spears run out of angle here. The poleaxe sings. You post halfway up the haft, present the top spike in a high guard that's also a roof, and you gatekeep. Anything that rises through hand, helm, hope gets hammered down or picked and shoved. Behind you, halberds work diagonals, chopping at wrists and ankles, hooking, driving men sideways so they tumble on their friends. This is not duel culture. It's crowd control by leverage. None of it works without boring excellence. Feet. Watch a veteran halberdier, and you'll notice his head barely bobbles while the weapon does wild things. That's footwork, half steps that steal distance, pivots that keep hips loaded, a back foot that never paints itself into a corner. It matters because overreach is how you die. The axe face is greedy. It wants to chase. The hook is greedy. It wants to yank too far. The spike is honest. It points where you live. Feet tell hands what's allowed. Good lines trust their feet more than their courage. What about counters from the other side of the shaft? Shields and forward tilt still save lives, especially against chopping edges. A smart swordsman, half swords, taking his blade midpoint, like a short spear to stab underarms and into armpits before halberd heads can cycle. 2 opponents, stepping to opposite angles, bracket a polearm and force it to commit across its own center, the slowest turn in the world. Missile troops exploit the beats. You loose when the axe face is down and the hook is still coming up. And in the Age's late chapters, handguns and crossbows sneak into these rhythms, pinning heads at the very moment a halberd needs clear eyes to choose its verb. That's the bridge we're approaching. Powder. Before we cross it in the finale, it's worth noticing how naturally gunpowder plugged into the logic already at work. Lines were about rolls. Powder adds a new one, disruption at range, and the polearms don't vanish. They shepherd the shooters. Early firearms are slow, smoky, and stubborn in the rain. They need halberds and pikes to keep angry men with short steel away, while vents are primed and matches ready. Captains begin to weave, shot to shake, pike to pin, axe to finish. The names change by century and region: pike and shot. Tercio, Landsknecht evolutions, but the feeling on the ground stays recognizable. Layers, timing, options. There's a cultural footnote here too. Weapons are tools, but they're also languages. A sword speaks of rank and single combat. A halberd speaks of city militias, watchmen, and professionals who fight as part of something larger than themselves. Guilds carried halberds on parade days because they were honest about what protected their streets. Trained people with practical sticks and businesslike steel. That civic identity matters. The same men who guarded a gate on Tuesday could swing a hammer on Wednesday, file taxes on Thursday, and muster on Friday. The weapon fit their week. By now, you can probably feel the pattern braided through the series. Every new device we met wasn't just metal. It was method, a way of seeing the opponent that turned his pride into a lever. Plate promised invincibility, hammers made it a drum. Shields promised certainty. Flails wrote around the edges. Horses promised shock. Spikes turned speed into a liability. Distance promised safety. Torsion engines and gravity removed distance as a variable. In the crush, poleaxes and halberds promised something rarer: continuity. They kept lines coherent when chaos tried to turn groups into men. One chapter remains. We'll keep our promise and walk across that bridge to the threshold of gunpowder, where fire and lead begin to rewrite distances and decisions, and where many of these beautiful, brutal tools keep working longer than their eulogies admit. Then we'll close with the real point of all this iron. Not how people died, but what their weapons say about how they thought about leverage, budgets, fear, and the stubborn human habit of turning problems into handles. Gunpowder enters like a rumor and leaves like a revolution. It doesn't erase everything we've seen, it absorbs it, translates it, then changes the verbs. The first handguns look like plumbing projects: iron tubes spiked to wooden staves, touch holes that hiss when you coax them, powder that clumps when it rains. They belch more smoke than certainty. Spit sparks back at the man who lights them, and send projectiles that wobble through the air like drunken bees. And yet, a fist-sized lead ball does not ask armor for permission. The calculus of plate. the proud curves, the Milanese polish, the fluting that stiffens without weight, meets a new kind of pressure, with no romance attached. But it's not a snap cut from halberds to muskets. For a long, awkward middle chapter, pike and shot is the grammar that armies speak. The formation is a conversation. Gunners and crossbowmen forward to disrupt, pikes to deny, halberds and swords to finish. A sergeant with a whiskered voice barks the sequence, and you can hear how old and new dovetail. Make ready, powder to pan, match to serpent, eyes on the sergeant. Give fire! A crumpling crack down the line, white breath of saltpeter rolling forward like a fog bank. Recover! Butts to the ground, men stepping back through files of pike that bristle like a forest, ready to spear anyone who tries to cash in on the gunner's vulnerable seconds. This braid lives or dies on timing. A gun that takes 20 seconds to reload is a promise that must be protected for 19 of them. Pikes and polearms become shepherds of the match. Your best halberdiers no longer hunt every opening. They hunt openings near men with slow fire. The unit, not the duelist, wins. Armor knows the script is changing and auditions for a new role. You see the rise of the three-quarter harness breast, back, tassets, maybe a Burgonet or Morion optimized to shrug glancing shot and deflect sword cuts, while keeping weight down for men who must walk far and reload under stress. You see proof marks, little stamps on breastplates where a smith fired a pistol at the steel to show it could take a close-range kiss. You see cavalry reimagine itself as reiters with wheelock pistols, riding in caracole to discharge and wheel away, or as cuirassiers who double down on shock, trusting heavy armor and straight sabers to smash the soft center before powder can speak enough times. The conversation between weapon and counterweapon didn't stop. It accelerated. Sieges feel the pivot even harder. Cannons first brash, then discipline teach stone walls what trebuchets hinted. Height without thickness is vanity. Medieval curtains, tall and elegant, give way to trace Italian bastions, low, star-shaped earthworks that swallow shot and spit it back along planned killing lanes. Artillery becomes geometry. Engineers sketch angles like composers, jot bars, and whole towns are drawn as instruments of denial. The trebuchet doesn't vanish because someone outlawed it. It vanishes because the budget for building and feeding one now buys powder and shot that do the job sooner. Gravity remains undefeated, but black powder makes gravity a partner instead of a master. If this sounds like a eulogy for everything iron and hafted, hold the bell. The old kit lives on because war still has places where hands matter more than charges. Street fights, breach fights, shipboard melees where smoke blinds and planking shakes with every broadside. Ask the boarding party sprinting across a heaving gap if a poleaxe is obsolete when the deck bucks and a match cord is wet. Ask the city watch what fits a stairwell better. A matchlock taller than a man or a halberd that can hook, smack and thrust without setting tapestries on fire. Ask the prisoner taker in a riot if a man-catcher has lost its logic when a ransom becomes a warrant and a noble becomes a slippery alderman. The world modernizes unevenly. Old answers persist where the constraints that made them good still exist. You can track the long goodbye in the manuals. Late medieval fight books that once sang arming sword and poleaxe begin to append pistol plays and counters to short-shot ambushes. City statutes that once specified how many men must muster with bows now count barrels and pikes. Guild banners still parade halberds, but the guard behind the banner has a bandolier of powder, flasks the 12 apostles, and a snaffance that, on a dry day, will behave. Courtiers keep rapiers for status and street duels. Soldiers keep what solves work. Here's the parallel that matters for us as viewers and makers of stories. Every weapon we walked past in this series didn't just change outcomes, it changed behavior. The warhammer changed how knights wore confidence. The flail changed how shields were held. The Godendag changed where cavalry dared to ride. The Zweihänder changed the idea of impenetrable formation. The man-catcher changed what victory meant in cash terms. The Morning Star changed how much fear a silhouette could carry. The Bec de Corbin changed armor design by pointing at seams with a smith's finger. The Ballista and Scorpion changed who could stand where and for how long. The Trebuchet changed whether walls were answers or questions. Gunpowder ties the thread. It changes what distance means, what thickness means, what together means, and every change created counter-changes. That's the heartbeat underneath the iron, the dialectic of problem and handle. You armor a chest? Somebody invents a way to move force through it. You block with a shield, someone bends a path around edges. You charge faster, someone plants a spike and lets your speed do their job. You stand on a wall, someone builds a machine that makes up irrelevant. You hide behind thickness, someone puts fire in a tube and teaches stone a new vocabulary. Each solution is temporary, each fix a future fault line. If there's a single insight to carry out of the mud and smoke, it's that weapons are tools for budgets as much as for bodies. Metal and labor are scarce. Training time is a currency. Terrain is a price you pay or a rebate you collect. The warhammer succeeds because it's cheap to learn and durable to keep. The flail succeeds in the hands of those who can afford the bruises and the months. The Godendag wins because a community can make 500 fast and teach 500 faster. The Zweihänder earns double pay because not many can carry the overhead. The man-catcher profits because a live noble funds a winter. The Morning Star thrives where simplicity plus dread is worth more than finesse. The Corbin pays dividends in moments you convert. Engines pay dividends in hours you bend. Gunpowder pays dividends in miles you erase. This all lands in a place that's easy to miss when we're distracted by gleam and gore. Beneath every blade and beam is a human trying to solve. A weaponsmith is a kind of empath listening to fear and translating it into geometry. A captain is a kind of accountant turning risk into formations that won't default under stress. A soldier is a kind of craftsman learning a small set of motions so deeply that they work when heartbeat and horizon both go loud. That's why the artifacts pull our eyes in museums. They're not just relics of endings, they're notes from problem solvers. And if you're telling stories in this niche, long-form, late-night, slow-burn history for listeners who drift off somewhere between a beak finding a seam and a stone finding a parapet, there's your North Star. Don't just name the hardware. Show the problem each piece set out to solve. Show the counter it provoked. Show the behavior it forced, how men stood, how they breathed, where they dared step, when they chose not to. Show the ledger behind the legend, the guild hall where spikes were counted, the rainy morning where matches wouldn't take, the bent release pin that moved a boulder 30 feet and decided a gate's fate. When gunpowder finally takes the lead and the old shapes dim, tip your hat but don't put the lights out. A halberd is still a halberd when a street needs calming. A hammer is still a hammer when a door needs persuading. A beak is still a beak when a hinge says no. Technology keeps walking forward. Leverage never goes out of style. And that's our quiet coda. Medieval battlefields weren't won by chivalry or shine. They were won by people who learned to make force efficient at the skull, at the seam, at the shield edge, at the base of a wall, at the edge of a city's courage. If you listen closely, all the weapons we met are saying the same humble thing. Give me a place to stand, a mass to move, a weakness to press, and I'll make something heavy go where it doesn't want to. That truth didn't retire when the powder took fire. It just found new barrels to live in. Lights down, the forge cools, the field clears. Somewhere a smith taps, slag off a last spike. A captain writes a number in a leather book, and a soldier oils a hinge on a shaft he'll hang by the door. The problem will return tomorrow. So will the handles.